Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out tonight. And thank you again to Denver Droids and GDG Denver for hosting my talk and the fabulous talks of Abby and Margaret as well. Thank you very much. So tonight I'm going to talk about developing accessible Android applications. And here's our schedule. So first we're going to go over what does it mean when people want accessible apps, Android and iOS comparison of where they're both at now. We'll explore Android's current accessibility features, and finally I'll do some code samples. So who am I? As Mark mentioned, I'm currently an Android developer at this company, iTriage, but I'm also working as the accessibility lead for all three platforms, that's iOS, web, and Android for our newest apps. So why do I care about accessibility? So it all started back in my undergraduate career. A friend of mine was getting his master's in architecture, and he was doing a study, and he had to do a big presentation at the end of his class. So his study was about the accessible pathways at the CU Boulder campus for specifically wheelchair accessibilities. So he presented this talk to me, and of course it was great. I gave him some feedback, but one thing really stuck with me, and it was this picture. He walked down the main corridor of the CU Boulder campus and made note of all of the doors that weren't accessible by wheelchair. And what he found was that almost half of the doors that weren't accessible were because of a single stair. So this is crazy, and it made me really mad for two reasons. So the first reason it made me mad was, this is stupid, right? One stair. This isn't like some grand architectural statement. They could have just sloped the sidewalk up a little bit. Like, this is completely unnecessary. But secondly, and more importantly, the reason that I was angry was that I had never noticed. That because I wasn't in a wheelchair, I had never noticed that there were these huge barriers to entry. This specific doorway, I had already gone in at this point in my life over 100 times, and never thought twice about it. So this is sort of the same thing with programming for accessibility, right? As an architect of software, we have a lot of single steps in our code. Just one tiny slope up to the building. It's easy for us to do as programmers, but the only reason we're not doing it is because we realize it was a barrier in the first place. So that's sort of my preface of why I care about accessibility and why you should too. So what does accessibility even mean? So there's some major groups of accessibility. There's mobile impairment, there's audio impairment, and there's vision impairment. So if someone's using a smartphone, specifically an Android device, and they have these types of impairment, what are they going to do? So all of these impairments are on a spectrum. So for mobility impairment, the lowest end is dexterity issues, and that's why in Android we have something called the 48 dp rhythm. It means that none of your buttons should be smaller than 48 dp in width and height. And also in the accessibility settings you can set touch and hold delays for what a long press means, depending on the type of issues you're currently experiencing. And then on the other extreme, we've got complete paralysis. So you can still actually interact with the smartphone if you have complete paralysis in two ways. One's a head switch, which is literally a giant switch mounted on the top of your wheelchair, or sip and puff, which is a straw that you breathe in and out to navigate through your app. So if someone has audio impairment, again, there's definitely a spectrum here, but a way to get around that on a smart device is to always have any audio notifications to have a visual or a tactile feedback, as well as you can turn on system-wide closed captioning on your device. Visual impairment is the hardest one to design for, and that's the one I'm going to focus on tonight. So this has quite a big spectrum as well. So colorblind, the newest version of Android Lollipop now has colorblind settings, so you can set your specific version of colorblindness in your settings, and your entire phone will change for you automatically. If you have low vision, there's also an accessibility setting to bump up the contrast across all apps on your phone. And if you have complete blindness, you're going to have to rely on TalkBack, which is the screen reader for Android devices. All right, so a little Android versus iOS comparison. So iOS has typically been the heavy hitter in accessibility, but there have been a lot of improvements in Android. So just sort of a side-by-side comparison, Android has had a screen reader actually all the way back since Donut, which is pretty early on. It just wasn't that great. So it has been getting better. Something that's interesting about TalkBack though is that like the improvements aren't really versioned, so there's not a really good history of the versions. iOS uses VoiceOver, which is the same screen reading technology that Macs use. Of course, Android has poor documentation. This is both in the user space and the developer space. And another thing that's kind of tricky is that right now there's a small but rapidly growing community of blind Android users. So if you can't find it in the documentation, it's a little hard too because your community is even smaller to reach out. Something that iOS does that Android hasn't done yet is called screen blanking. So think about it. If you can't see your phone, why would you waste your battery power just lighting up the screen? So iOS has let you turn the screen off so you can still interact with the screen, but it's just not wasting all the battery power. Android doesn't have that one yet. Android also doesn't have a quick on-off for the screen reader. So usually on iOS you can tap 3 times in the home button and it'll toggle the screen reader on and off. So think about it, your screen reader is constantly reading everything that's coming across your phone, like whether it's a text from your husband or a tweet or an email from your boss, it's just like blasting that to the world. So if you're in a situation like a meeting or lunch with someone, you might want to turn it off for a while. I was talking with a blind woman and she said who has an Android phone, and she said it's kind of a bummer because she can't turn TalkBack off without getting sighted help to then turn it back on. So I think that one's, Android actually says that they do support it. I have it turned on my phone, and I worked with Amelia, the blind woman, for like 25 minutes. We tried to get it to work, and we could, between the two of us, we could never get it to work. So Android claims they have it, but I would say it's still in beta. But of course, you know, Android's positive pieces, it's definitely got the price point going for it, and that's what I was talking with Amelia about. Over 80% of the blind community is unemployed, which is a pretty staggering statistic. And so to be able to offer them a more cost-effective way to connect with digitally in the world around them is awesome. But also the Android system is open. And a lot of apps that are cool for accessibility are apps that take over your entire device and really need to capitalize on that amount of control that Android gives and iOS doesn't give. So I think this is a great opportunity for us as developers to sort of capitalize on this as an early market. People are starting to shift over to Android, and this is a big thing that as Android developers we can capitalize on.
Question about that?
Yeah.
How big is that market you're talking about right there? Like,
how big is the market? Like the number of blind people that are specifically using Android devices, I don't have that statistic. Unfortunately. It's still predominantly iOS, yes.
Have you tried using an NFC tag to turn on and off TalkBack?
I have not. So the question was, have you tried to use an NFC tag to turn on and on TalkBack? I have been unable to figure out programmatically how to turn on and off TalkBack, even just like hard coding, turning it on and off. This goes back to that poor documentation part. All right, so I'm going to switch over to this camera here. If you want to, if you have an Android device, which I hope you do, you can switch over and go along with me. Oops. Let me close this out. Close that. Sure. Just for safe measure. Oh man, Mark really put a lot of things in. Okay, here we go. I'm going to move this around, otherwise I'm going to get confused. Okay. So accessibility settings are at the very bottom of your device. And the first one you'll notice is TalkBack. So TalkBack is the screen reader I was talking about. This next one, BrailleBack. This one's pretty cool, actually. So BrailleBack, this is a Braille keyboard. You can plug it into your phone, and these little dots will raise up and down to show Braille letters. And you can also type using Braille. So this is widely in use with the deaf-blind community, but also, you know, you might not always want to hear someone reading something to you in like a mechanized voice. Sometimes it's nice to just hear your own voice in your head. So you can turn on, like I mentioned, you can turn on closed captioning, you can magnify things, but some interesting things, TalkBack has its own settings. So if you go all the way down here at the bottom, TalkBack settings are awesome. So one of the cool things is you can do custom gestures And so if there's an app that you constantly like to open, you can set up a custom gesture to do that. Again, in a lot of the accounts of blind users online and the people I've talked with, it's hard to get these things set up without sighted help, but once they're set up, it's awesome and it will really make your life a lot easier. So something for developers that's important to know. Oh, that glare is pretty bad there. There's a special developer settings piece here at the bottom of TalkBack, so you have even more developer options. So just something to note. All right, so now I'm going to get into how to use TalkBack. So I'm going to turn TalkBack on. Hopefully she's loud enough. So you just toggle a switch.
Settings.
You guys hear that? Yeah. Okay, cool. So touch to explore means you're literally just dragging your finger around the screen.
When TalkBack is on, your device provides.
So as soon as my finger runs into something, it'll start telling you what it is. Another way that you can do this is you can just swipe your finger back and forth, left and right, and it'll
Settings.
go through each item.
On, switch, TalkBack, navigate up.
So when I hit the bottom of the screen, you'll notice like a little like click. Let me do that again.
On, with, settings.
That little like tap. So that's what's called an ear con, and there are lots of these all over TalkBack. It's an audible icon. These little sounds that like mean specific things, and it's really cool. I put my phone on TalkBack for a whole week and used it. It was frustrating at the beginning, but it was really cool how I didn't even realize I like knew these little ear cons, and I was learning them. Let's see what else. Oh, to select any item, you just double tap on it. If you're sliding around a page view or a list view, you have to use both fingers to slide. You can tap once to silence and ear con clues. I already went through that. So TalkBack also has these special gestures, these 90-degree movements with your finger, and this is also what I was talking about. You can program these to be anything specific. So home and back are really handy ones. I use those a lot. But one of the coolest one is the global context menu. So I'm gonna down and right. So it brings up this little menu
Touch
with
the screen and
the
explore in a circle to find
middle
an item,
piece.
then lift to select.
And the most important one is the one just off to my left. It's called quick navigation.
Quick navigation menu.
So now this
Touch
is
the
like
screen
a
and explore
radio
in a
dial.
circle. Settings. On, TalkBack, navigate up.
So
Cancel, TalkBack, navigate up.
she lists out all the possible settings in like a little tiny space. So if the thing that is super ironic, like phones are getting bigger and bigger, right? But like if you can't see the visual display, like why do you care about that? And even with the smaller display, it's really hard to like navigate through all these elements. But that little radial dial gives you a lot of control in like a really small space. So a couple interesting things I've learned as a developer. Turning TalkBack on and off apparently sometimes turns off USB debugging. So this is really frustrating. It took me a while to realize what was going on because I'd be developing and then all of a sudden like there would be no ADB connection and I'm like unplugging, replugging, restarting ADB, and yes, no. TalkBack just magically turns it off, so just be aware of this. TalkBack's not supported in your emulator, so you're going to have to use an actual device if you want to hear what she's saying. This makes sense, no screenshots are enabled when TalkBack's on. Why would you want to screenshot it if you're blind? But actually in development, sometimes it's nice to be able to show like what pieces are being highlighted by TalkBack. So I got around this by plugging my device in and running ASM or Droid at Screen, which are like screen emulators, and then doing a screenshot on my computer of what was on my device. So kind of roundabout. And this last one, beware of QA. So sometimes, this is more prevalent in iOS, but sometimes QA likes to hijack the content description, which we'll talk about in a little bit, for their automated testing, and don't let them do that because then your blind users will hear the wrong thing. All right, so I wrote up a little app to
Recent apps.
demonstrate some accessibility pieces.
Recent app. Recent apps. Camera. Eventbrite. Accessibility tech. Accessibility tech. Text view examples button. Text view examples.
Okay, so my first example is clickable text views. So we all know that this can be done. You can set an on-click lister on a text view, but you shouldn't do it because there's no way for your blind user to know that this is clickable. So maybe you've styled it visually so it makes sense to someone who's not vision impaired, but through TalkBack, they're just going to hear the word. So unless it sounds actionable, like my words sound actionable, they're telling you this is a clickable text view, it's going to be hard to know. So I'm going to navigate through and select that.
Text view examples. More options button. This is a clickable text view. You click the text view.
So you notice in Android, this is called a toast. It just showed up for a brief moment. So the default for accessibility is if a toast's showing up, she automatically reads it out. So that's free in the box. You don't have to worry about that. My next example is if your text view is going to be different for TalkBack. So this one is a great one. So that next word, that second word, what do you think in your head when you see that? Day? What do you? I heard some people say something else over here. Jamaica? There you go. I heard some other people say Monday. That when you see that, you think Monday. And so TalkBack is all about representing what you hear inside your head and not necessarily like the text that's on the screen. So you can set a different text from what's showing to visual users and visually impaired users.
Monday.
So everything in accessibility is done by setting content descriptions on a view. And you can set a content description on any view. So here's the text view layout code, and here is setting the actual text that's going to show to visual users, and then you just set the content description to something else, and it will override that for you. Edit text are pretty easy also.
Edit box. Type here.
So if she announces edit box before, that automatically happens if you're using an edit text. So if you're rolling your own, you don't get that, but if you just use the native elements, that's handy. And then she automatically reads the hint. So make your hint something actually useful. So here we have the edit text code, and all you have to do is hint, and you just automatically get it. All right, so here's one tricky one. Hidden text view.
Toggle visibility button.
So this button will show and hide a text view, and when I click on it,
This was a hidden text view.
she reads out the text. This is actually not native behavior. Unlike a toast, she wouldn't read this. So this is something to really be considerate about if you're showing and hiding things dynamically in your app and expecting users to want to interact with those things. You're going to want to tie them in with content description. So here's the on-click listener for my text view. And this is the important part. If we're setting the view to visible, then we say send accessibility event type view focused. So this will force the screen reader from wherever she's at to come zoom in and read the words that you've just selected. This one's, you gotta be careful with this because you only want to use it when it's really important. So sometimes you'll have images that are dynamically changing. Amelia, one of my, the blind people I'm working with at the Blind Institute of Technology, told me about, she's trying to read some article on NPR. She's like halfway through the article. Every time someone posted a new tweet, the screen reader would pull her over to their Twitter feed. So she could never finish the article. She's like, I don't care about your tweets. Like, and so she would like try and like copy paste the article and read it somewhere else. It was just like this huge headache, right? So be cognizant of when you refocus the view. Only do it on things that are really pertinent to the user experience. Don't do it on random things. Yes?
Another question. Has the Android Studio lint checker kept up with making suggestions about what you should be doing?
Yeah, so the question was, has the Android Studio lint checker kept up with suggestions for accessibility? Yes, so their big one that they do is for image buttons, and I'll be talking about that later, but they don't do stuff like this, which is surprising to me. I think that this would be a great one to easily flag, like, you're setting this is visible and invisible, like, would you like to share that with all users? So speaking of lint checks, he wasn't a plant, I promise. So this one is all over every Android code base I have ever seen. Like people just see that and they just eyes gloss over and they just like move right along, right? So you should only put text content descriptions on image views that have a meaning. And what does that mean? Well, I will show you.
Back. Accept. Image view examples button. Image view examples.
Okay, so I have a quiz here about what type of Pokemon this is. And if I was just reading this, what type of Pokemon is this, I would have no idea because it's a picture of a Pokemon. So this is important to the point of my app. I have to tell people which Pokemon this is so that they can guess which type.
Image. What type of Pokemon is this? Bulbasaur. Reveal answer button.
So then I see, and then I can go through.
Bulbasaur is dual type grass and poison.
So there we go. So only put content descriptions on images that have actual specific meaning. And here's the image view, very easy. You just one-liner, content description, Bulbasaur. Decorative image, you don't want to put content descriptions on decorative images because that will just be really annoying to your users. So I'm going to swipe to the right, and you'll see that the content, that the accessibility just skips right over these balloons.
Show Pokemon button. Bulbasaur is dual type grass and poison.
So this is just like a visual divider for visual users, and it doesn't have any meaning. So you have to set the content description to null because that forces the screen reader to not read it. They have a new one out, API 15 and higher, important for accessibility, false. That's another XML attribute, but that only works for API 15 and up, so this one will work for everyone. And then this last one is image button states. So Pandora was a big offender of this for a long time. If you hit the play button, you know, when you look at the picture, it turns to a pause sign, and then you hit the pause button, it turns to a play sign, right? But Pandora just always said pause button, like no matter what it was. So it was frustrating to me because sometimes it's like, okay, is my music actually paused, or is Pandora like crapping out on its load time? Like, I don't know, because it's always saying it's the pause button. So here's an example. My Pokeball is closed right now, but I wanted to open and display the Pokemon.
Show Pokemon button. Now showing Pokemon. Hide Pokemon button.
So now the buttons. At first it said show Pokemon, now it says hide Pokemon. I click it again.
Bulbasaur, show Pokemon button.
So you can toggle, just like you can toggle an image, you can also toggle a content description. So here we have this layout for all Pokemon and my button. On the on-click listener, if it's visible, then I'm going to set it to gone. Then I'm going to change my image resource. So this is all boilerplate that we've already done before, and then you just update your content description. So when the Pokeball opens,
show Pokemon button. Now showing Pokemon.
It also says now showing Pokemon. So I did a little trick there with setting accessibility view focused. So the all Pokemon layout, I said focus that view, and I set a content description on it. So, and then this last one is to read a layout as an element.
Layout examples, but layout examples.
So sometimes you're in a situation where you maybe need to have multiple text views or multiple, like a text view and an image and then a text view, but like to a visual user, you'd read it all as one thing. So each one of these words is actually a different text view. And so by default, the screen reader would read it as read, and then you'd have to swipe again for me, and swipe again for as. But I've programmed it so that it reads it as a single view.
Layout examples. More options, but read me as a single item.
So that's actually not too tricky to do. In iOS, they actually have like a native element for this, or a native method that you just call pretty easy on the layout, but you have to kind of do a little more legwork in Android. So the first thing you have to do is pick all of the views that are contained in your main view and set them all as not important for accessibility. And you also have to use the v4 support library if you're doing this. Then, I grab the text from every one of those views, and I compile it into like the master content description, and I set the master content description on the layout that wraps the whole text view. And then my final piece that I'm going to talk about is visual layout versus talkback. So this is one of the things that kind of frustrates me as a developer is there isn't a lot of information about how talkback is going through your views. And most of the time it's pretty straightforward, but I found an example in the Google Now Weather app that really like brought this to a point. Google has since changed their code, so there's no longer this accessibility bug, which is good, I guess, but it messed up my presentation. So anyway, so when we look at this weather app, right, we see columns. Monday, it's cloudy, 55 is the high, the low is 28, right? And then we go on to Tuesday. But the way that TalkBack was reading this out was she was saying Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Rainy, rainy, cloudy, sunny, sunny. 55, 41, 34, 46, 48. So you had to like, if you wanted to know the weather on Thursday, you just had to like count, right? It's ridiculous.
It's easy.
It's like, why? So I was like, oh, I bet, I knew right off the bat, right? I was like, I bet that Google did their layouts like stacked, horizontal layouts or something, and so that's why it's reading it wrong. And then I did the layout drop bounds, and it totally wasn't. They did all of their layouts in columns. And so TalkBack does this like optimization where she tries to figure out like, oh, this is probably how they want me to read it, and it was wrong. So now, Google has done the trick I just showed you with the multiple text views. So they set a content description on this entire layout. They set all of these, I don't know specifically how they're doing it, but this is probably how they're doing it. Setting these all to false, and then setting the content description on the layout. And if you turn TalkBack on for the Google Weather Now app, you'll even hear her, she'll say, Friday, sunny, or Friday, chance of rain. So it's like applying those things when you look at these pictures, what you hear in your head, and that's what TalkBack is saying for you. So pretty interesting. So my silly little Pokemon accessibility app is available on GitHub if you guys would like to download it and play around with it. But that's all I have for tonight, so thank you very much.
Kelly, I have a question. What if you write an app that supports accessibility? Is there any way, if a blind person is going to the Play Store, is there any way that the Google Play Store highlights apps that support accessibility?
That is a great question. So Zeddy asked, if you are developing an app that's great in accessibility, is there any way to highlight that in the Play Store? And right now there's not. So we talked with the Blind Institute of Technology, and they were sort of like, the blind community is really strong, and they like circulate things internally in their own circles through like their